election security to speak to you more about what the issues are, what the threats are, the clear solutions to them, and why we need your help to solve this serious issue in every county and state. Actions can be taken to secure our election systems, our voting systems, and we need more political support from those of you on the phone and folks all over the country to make that happen. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, our first speaker. Professor Rich DeMillo is the Warren Professor of Computing and Professor of Management, as well as the Dean of Computing and the Executive Director and founder of the Center for 21st Century Universities at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He's the author of over 100 articles, books, and patents, and he has held academic positions at 3 other universities. He also was the first Chief Technology Officer at Hewlett-Packard and served on the National Science Foundation as well. I think he does a brilliant job of framing the problem and the threat of election security for us, and then we'll be hearing from a number of other wonderful longtime experts in the field about the solutions and what you can do. Rich.
Great, thank you. Let me try to put this in presentation mode. How's that look?
Looks great.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. So my job, I guess, for this morning is to in 10 minutes or so give you a 2-semester course in cybersecurity, and tell you a little bit about the threats that the election system is facing. And I want to hit highlights. I want to hit things that you don't have to be an expert in computer science to appreciate. And the first thing that I want to point out is that, and this is a challenge for election security, that security is an end-to-end property of a system. And unfortunately, the way the election systems are organized with layers of certification, we sometimes forget this fact. So we can have certified components of an election system and still have an election system that end-to-end fails to provide security, either from tampering or release of privacy, protected information, or actually any kind of security breach. And this picture, I think, really illustrates the facts. So here we have a really good certified padlock on a system that, when you look at it, is patently insecure. Security people call this steel doors in paper walls, and the way that we've built the technology for election systems in this country, it's riddled with steel doors and paper walls. In fact, it's not even actually the case that our padlocks are that good. Electronic voting machines, which is what we're talking about this morning, are actually pretty crappy padlocks. We built this technology in about the turn of the century on technology that was already old at the time. This is near and dear to my heart because I used to sell the things on the right, the Hewlett-Packard Giornata, the old technology that was first generation of smartphones, and the problem is that we built voting machines, electronic voting machines, using exactly the same technology. If you were to take one of the HP Giornatas that I have on the shelf behind me and put it in this kind of wrapper that you see on the left, you would get a modern voting machine. And that technology is now 15 years old or more. It was never very good at the time, but it's what we've built our infrastructure on today, which is a huge problem. And I always like this view of the world to show you how much things have changed since the year 2000, since the year 1998. So the antivirus industry in 1998 thought it had the bad guys on the run, and we had all the tools, we had all the technology at our disposal. Unfortunately, and we've seen this in recent months, the bad guys have armed themselves with exactly the same technology, and now they've got us on the run. So there's this huge disconnect between what we have available in front of us to conduct elections and how the universe of bad actors who might want to penetrate our election systems view what we have. I think it's always good to ground ourselves in a little bit of reality. If you look at the voting technology that's in use in the U.S. today, there has never been an unsuccessful attempt to hack these machines. I just let that sink in for a couple seconds. Over the last 15 years, dozens, maybe hundreds of demonstrations, laboratory experiments, analysis by defense contractors. Every single one has succeeded in getting into the machines. So even though we think of security as this end-to-end property, and we might be putting a lot of faith in the padlocks, the electronic voting machines that are supposed to secure the vote, the reality of the world today is that it is ridiculously easy to hack literally every piece of voting technology in use in the country. There was an event last summer in Las Vegas at a conference called DEF CON 25. You can see a picture of it here, where a bunch of people with no particular expertise, as far as I could tell, in election security, sort of descended on this room and hacked into virtually every voting machine that's being used in the country, including the ones in use in my state of Georgia. Another thing to consider is that we tell ourselves stories about how secure our election system is, and I hear this a lot because voting security has been an issue in Atlanta and Georgia. So I hear, for example, that our voting machines are never connected to the internet. This is a concept called air gapping. There's a gap, literally an air gap between the voting machines and the internet, because there's no wire. The only problem with that is that it's not a guarantee of much of anything. In fact, it's easy to find websites that are all about hacking air-gapped networks. There's a whole field of cybersecurity devoted to getting into machines that appear to be inaccessible by traditional networks. And there are these, as you can see on this screen, boot camps that teach people how to do that. Even if you conceded that air gapping didn't provide any particular guarantee for security, you would have to contend with the problem that the way that we use voting technology moves removable media, USB sticks or memory cards or whatever they turn out to be, from one machine to the next. And what we tell ourselves is that any attempt to attack a voting machine using that kind of medium is unrealistic, which ignores the fact that the U.S. probably itself mounted the first air gap attack using removable media when it attacked the nuclear infrastructure in Iran in the Stuxnet attack. And Kim Zetter has written a wonderful book that describes the process of doing that. And then the last myth that we tell ourselves is that, you know, all of these attacks are sort of academic. They would require physical access to machines in order to mount them. And we watch these machines like hawks. We make sure that there are armed guards around these machines. No one is ever going to get access to the machines to mount the kinds of attacks that we're talking about, which would be great if it were true. But the fact of the matter is, in Georgia and in many jurisdictions around the country, voting machines stack up in unlit hallways in elementary schools and libraries and universities like Georgia Tech, and the certifications require only that this cable lock the machines down. But if you look very carefully at this picture, you'll notice that the cables go through the handles of the machines, and the handles aren't connected to any locks at all. You can simply open the machines. So if we step back from that and say, what do we have to know about people who might want to hack a U.S. election? The easiest thing to do is to go to Netflix and watch Home Alone, because everything you need to know about hacking a computer was already discovered by the wet bandits in Home Alone. If you're a burglar, what you need to do is find a likely spot, find a likely target, case the joint, find points of entry, and attack the weakest point. Every burglar knows how to do this. It's exactly the kind of attack that a cyber criminal mounts. And in fact, the 3 steps of attacking a computer or attacking a network are designed specifically to parallel what the Home Alone bandits did. Casing the joint is something called footprinting. Finding entry points is obtained by scanning networks. Attacking the weakest point is by a process called enumeration. So if you just think in a common sense sort of way, what would you do if you were a bad guy trying to attack a network? This is the kind of thing that you would think about. Now, what I'd like to do is just let you watch this video run for a few seconds. This is a capture of attack traffic from last fall, from the middle of October through November 1st. And what I'm doing is showing you, I think in fairly graphic terms, that what we're talking about is not an academic exercise. So around November 1st of last year, some country in Asia, most likely North Korea, decided that it would mount a state-sponsored attack against the U.S. and in South Korea. And what you see here is the cyber equivalent of nuclear war. What you see are packets flowing through public networks being used simply to attack networks in the United States. So if you think that you're hiding in a neighborhood that's somehow immune from these kinds of attacks, you should just watch this video over and over again, because this occurs every day. It occurs every month. It tends to peak around times when there are public events taking place, like elections, and we will see the same kind of attack being mounted in late spring and early autumn of 2018. I guess the next thing to think about is what would you do if you found out that you had left the front door of your house open, and someone may have broken into the house. You might want to go and make sure the TV is there and the family silver hasn't been lifted. So we know that U.S. election systems are subject to attack. We can see the attacks happening. Remarkably, we've never checked to see if the family silver has been stolen. And in fact, Department of Homeland Security hasn't investigated whether voting machines were hacked in November 2016. Says it doesn't intend to. None of the forensic tools that you would apply in a bank or a university or any other secure system are being applied to investigate whether or not people have gotten into our election infrastructure. So just very quickly, let me give you a 30,000-foot view of the kinds of threats that we think about, and there are 3 stages to these threats. There are the kinds of things that we're hearing about with Facebook today, where there's large-scale social engineering that takes place to shift public opinion in one direction or another, usually by exploiting cognitive biases. It's a very sophisticated kind of attack. In the middle, you have attacks on data. Voter registration databases are perfect targets here. Those databases are largely unprotected. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. You can shift who actually votes by attacking those databases. And then on the right-hand side, we have access to the voting machines themselves, the kinds of things that the people in DEF CON Village, Hacking Village, did last year, either installing malware on the machines or opening the machines up and modifying the hardware. Now, the people that are most likely to do this have read all of the manuals on how to spy. And so they know, for example, that if you want to operate in plain sight with minimal risk to yourself, you operate on the left-hand end of the spectrum. You just try to shift public opinion by having bots flood Facebook or Twitter. You can't get a lot of precision by doing that. You can't guarantee that you're going to shift votes to one candidate or another, but you can get large-scale probabilities working in your favor. And as you move from left to right, you get more and more risk to the attacker, but you get more and more precision in what the attacker can do. So I just thought what I'd do very quickly is flash on the screen for you a few of the attacks that we know about that operate along this spectrum somehow. And I'm going to use a lot of Georgia examples because the Georgia election system is such a rich hunting ground for these examples that I can't resist. So unprotected access to voter databases. You can go to the My Voter page for the Secretary of State in the state of Georgia, pull up any voter whose name you happen to know, and modify their voter information. This happens to be the voter registration page for my wife, and I don't think I've gotten in trouble by modifying my wife's voter registration material, but I could have picked anyone. I could have picked the governor and modified voter information. And the risk is obvious. I think if you can make unauthorized contact information changes in the voter registration database, you can cause all kinds of chaos in the election system. At the very least, you open the door to identity theft, and you mess up the predictive analytics models that the political parties use to guarantee voter turnout on election day. Another Georgia example. Georgia has this system where we centralize the technology services for operating the voting machines, the Diebold voting machines, from a 6-month period beginning August 2016 to March 2017. All of the technology it takes to run elections in the state of Georgia was exposed to not only being indexed by Google, but being accessed by anyone in the world without a password. Kim Zetter has written a wonderful analysis of this event. What was compromised were not only voter records, but administrative passwords, the content management system that's used to provision electronic poll books, and all kinds of data operations that would be useful in the hands of an attacker to install malware on the machines. Not necessarily the voting machines that voters use, but the voting machines that are used to tally and tabulate votes. It's continuing along this line. The electronic poll books, the things that are used to check into an election site and provision the cards that are inserted in the voting machines, were stolen. 5 of them were stolen inexplicably from a pickup truck that was parked in a parking lot of a Publix grocery store. That theft wasn't reported for days. It happened just before the runoff election between John Ossoff and Karen Handel last March. The stolen equipment was never recovered. There were a variety of conflicting stories that were told about what happened to the equipment. The one thing that was never accounted for were the magnetic cards, the memory cards that were attached to the e-poll books when they were stolen. So we have no idea what happened to the cards that were in those machines, and whether or not those machines were actually destroyed in a landfill, as authorities said, or fell into the hands of cyber hackers. You can walk into any polling site in the state of Georgia and see a picture like this. These yellow cards are the cards that are inserted, the voter identification cards that are inserted in the voting machines. If you were to put some of them in your pocket, You can buy on eBay, and I just checked this morning, for $175. A programming tool that's used to program these cards. You can literally vote as many times as you want once you're able to do that. We think it hasn't been demonstrated yet, but we think you can actually install malware using these cards, and so the fact that the physical control of secure property at the voting site is handled in a haphazard way in itself is a risk. We know from the intelligence community that there were large-scale attacks on election systems. It's not clear exactly how many. At least 7 were hacked by Russia prior to the 2016 election. The intelligence community publishes cleansed versions of its risk profiles, and the Department of Homeland Security, for example, knows when spikes in activities are taking place. We know the countries, and in some cases, the exact locations that those attacks are being mounted from. You can see in the data, for example, a large spike in activity from an IP address that begins with 88 in September, October of last year. 888 is a domain that's assigned to WikiLeaks, and so you can see these activities taking place. Just to kind of fast forward to where we are today. We're now 15-20 years into this technology cycle. We have a lot of states, including Georgia, thinking about how to replace its aging technology, insecure technology, with new technology, and you see new generations of technology being introduced into the mix. There's a device called a ballot marking device, for example, that I think of as a $5,000 pencil. It's got a touch screen. A voter comes up, it touches the selections on election day, and what gets printed out is this receipt that you see here, and it's not exactly clear, but on the top of that receipt are some barcodes. The difficulty with ballot marking devices is that they serve no purpose. There is nothing in the workflow of conducting an election that depends on having a ballot marking device, with the possible exception of accommodations for disabled voters, which can be handled in completely different ways. They're unnecessary. They're expensive devices, and from my point of view, they're more dangerous than the current generation of touchscreen machines because they're more hackable than existing touchscreen systems. And it comes back to one of the assumptions that you have to carry into voter security in the cyber world, that the only verifiable ballot that you have is the one that the voter marks by hand. This is a real present threat. The idea that ES&S and Dominion and companies are selling these expensive electronic pencils to election officials containing things like barcodes is unexamined territory. There's an entire field of cyber hacking that's devoted to how you can poison barcodes, and so I don't think we want to be counting ballots that have poison barcodes on them. Just to finish up, there are things that don't fall into the categories that I've mentioned. Voting and counting of elections is supposed to be a public process. It's not always allowed to be public. Election officials are sometimes very protective of what they allow the public to view, and we've had instances here in Atlanta of election integrity activists, advocates wanting to observe the tallying process on election day and being shut out. And then I have to finish with the one thing that everyone who deals in cybersecurity knows implicitly. The insider threat is the most insidious, the least controllable risk in the whole process. people are the most effective, most cost-effective tools in attacking a system. All of the big intelligence leaks in U.S. history have not been conducted by building some massive piece of computing machinery to crack an encryption system, for example, but simply by bribing a high official. Robert Hansen, the FBI manager who was responsible for the largest single intelligence leak in U.S. history, had a pretty cheap price tag. He was bought for less than $1.5 million.
Wow.
So let me just bottom line this for you. We're coming into an election season with an increasing threat. We know from intelligence communities, from what's available on the web, that Russia will be mounting with state resources increased attacks on our system. Every new piece of technology we introduce into the voting process increases the risk. I think we in the election integrity community should have a mantra that says we need to decrease the amount of technology in the system to the bare minimum that it takes to run the election. Zero-day attacks are the norm. What's a zero-day attack? A zero-day attack is an attack that's over before you know you've been robbed. And so virtually every large-scale attack is a zero-day attack. We've already talked about hand-marked paper ballots. State actors can defeat any of the resources that we put together. So we have to build an end-to-end system. We have to build a system that assumes that at some point what we think is secure is going to be compromised by a bad guy, and build safeguards. And that's the whole point of audits. For example, audits are one of those redundant checks on the system. This last bullet I think is critical. The industry that we rely on to build these systems is structurally unable to build secure devices. There's not enough money in the electronic voting market to mount the R&D effort that it takes in order to build secure systems. So we have to look beyond the vendor profile. And just to finish up with something that we all reading about today, the retail market and voter registration databases has to stop. You can see what's happening with Facebook. The fact that we can obtain and analyze and modify voter data for money is a significant uncontrolled risk.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor DeMillo. I really appreciate you taking the time. For those who joined late, this is Akane Freechild with Public Citizen and the Secure Our Vote Coalition. I just want to flag that the Secure Our Vote Coalition is very much committed to accessibility, which includes having a ballot marking device for voters with disabilities in every voting district. But we do not need to replace all of our voting machines with ballot marking devices. And as you're about to hear, there are solutions to this very scary threat, which, we should assume that there will be hacks, but with paper ballot scanning systems and rigorous post-election audits, which is what the Secure Our Vote Coalition is all about, we can do a significant step towards securing the voting systems themselves. And there are some simple steps that we should be taking to secure registration systems as well. So I want to dig into that a little bit for you. We have the president of Verified Voting, Marion K. Schneider, on the line. She's got a very illustrious background with the Secretary of State's office in Pennsylvania as a civil rights lawyer with the Advancement Project voter protection program. She's got a lot of other great things I'd love to mention, but in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over to Marion.
Thank you, Akine, and thank Rich for scaring everybody on the call. I hope you can hear me. Unfortunately, I don't have good earbuds at the moment. I also, Verified Voting is fortunate to have Rich serving on our advisory board, and but I do want to take a little bit deeper dive into what we can do from a low-tech perspective. So everything that Rich showed you are risks, and we have to understand election administration as managing risks. That's what IT managers do every day. They're risks, not certainties. And so what one of the things that is evident from the information you just received is that it's not a question of if you're going to be attacked, but when you're going to be attacked. So the shift has to be from prevention to recovery. How are you going to understand or detect that something has occurred, and how are you going to recover from it? So if we want to focus on, and that's why we want to focus on voting systems, because currently in 13 states, either 100% or a significant percentage of voters are voting on systems that have no way to recover from an attack if one were able to be detected. So that's why we advocate for voter-marked paper ballots as the primary voting method. And what that means is not that those are hand counted, but that we leverage technology in the form of scanners to scan those ballots and to do it rapidly, because at some point along the line, speed became a value, a speed of reporting election results. But then those ballots are retained by the system and are available for recounts and audits. And so because those, so there are a lot of aspects and areas that we can advocate with respect to implementing voter-marked paper ballots. So first of all, having devices that permit voter-marked paper ballots and permit them to be scanned and retained for recounts and audits. Having a rigorous process so that we have a trustworthy record, so that when we are looking at those paper records during a recount or an audit, we know that they haven't been tampered with, that they have gone all down the process in a secure and verifiable way. That's what we refer to as end-to-end verifiable. And before we can even think about an electronic version of end-to-end verifiability, we have to implement that physically in the electoral space first. Now, I do want to raise, I agree with what Akine said about ballot marking devices. We do need accessible ballot marking devices for voters with disabilities. But one thing that we can talk about and we can advocate for is having the output of those ballot marking devices match the hand-marked paper ballots. I will say that there is a theme that is being repeated from in state legislatures, that they want the product of, that every voter should have the same document, that they should match. And so that's why, on the one hand, you get a push for every voter to use ballot marking devices, but you can do the flip side, where some voters mark their ballots by hand with a pen or a pencil, and other voters mark the ballot using assistive devices on a ballot marking device. And so that output matches what the voters are using. The bottom line is, in our view, is that separating the marking from the counting is protective, and having the device retain the paper records is critical to verifying that the reported results from the computers are correct. And that's where the audits come in. So we have been advocating, and Colorado conducted a statewide risk limiting audits, and that is a high-level quality control measure that uses statistical methods to sample a random number of ballots and make sure at a predetermined confidence level that the reported results are correct. And so the other issue that is very important to understand is that doing a recount by rescanning the ballots isn't going to detect any problem with the software. It might if different software is used, but that's not my understanding of how the rescanning of paper ballots occurs in states that just rescan them using the same software. That's not going to help anything. So both processes, audits and recounts, have to be done when we say manual, what we mean is there has to be a human inspection of the physical ballots and the human readable marks and text on those ballots. That's the only way you're going to be able to detect if the software is operating correctly. And having that physical human process is essential, because we can't tell if any of those risks that Rich described have been actualized unless we have a method of doing it. And it's a low-tech method, but under current technology, it's the best method that we have. And I know I have very little time to discuss these issues today. As far as the voter registration database, I will say that we have to be able to monitor those databases. That requires resources, because if you're monitoring to see if you're attacked, somebody's got to look at what you're capturing to make sure that nobody has gotten in. So that is a little bit resource intensive. The threat model for the voter registration databases is a little bit different, because hopefully we will be able to detect if somebody has interfered with the elections. So I think that there's been quite a few publications recently on how to protect voter registration databases. I think we need to focus, they're both pieces of the system, but as far as what occurs at the polling place or how our ballots are counted, we need to make sure that we separate the counting from the marking, and that we have a paper record that can be retained for recounts and audits. So with that, in my limited time, I'll stop and turn it over to Suzanne Goodman.
Oh, there. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Goodman. I'm the director of the Voting Integrity Program at Common Cause. And real thank you to my colleague Marion Schneider and Rich and Akane for doing this. So I hope folks understand that it is not hypothetical that our elections are at risk. They were targeted in the 2016 election. And we know this through a number of means. And I want to point out that the Senate Intelligence Committee did a very thorough investigation into what occurred with foreign interference in the 2016 election. And they left no stone unturned. And they also looked at attacks on our election infrastructure. And there were, we know from intelligence reports that the Russian spy agencies penetrated state and local election boards. We know that there were at least one database was penetrated. So we know there are attackers. We know we have a target on our back. And the good news, as Marion has said, is that we can deploy relatively low-tech defenses to protect our votes and our vote tallies from these attacks. And it's not just our country, all of our NATO allies, the UK, the Netherlands, France, they all use paper ballots for precisely this reason, that you can't hack paper. And it will be there if you run the ballots through a scanner and the scanner miscounts the votes. You can always go back and recount the paper because the paper can't be hacked. So in terms of an attack that could occur from like an offshore location far, far away, that is why we value paper so much. In the Senate Intelligence Committee, they therefore made that as one of their preliminary recommendations. They haven't released their full report, but they released a report with recommendations for elections, cybersecurity, how to secure our infrastructure, and they recommended that election jurisdictions in the United States go to paper, and that, as Marion said, that they institute post-election audits, which means you don't have to do a full hand recount of every single ballot. You can, using scientific methods, pull a number of those ballots and check the election results that way. And if you use statistical methodology, you can get to a very high confidence level. So this is what we are really advocating that advocates do. It's Common Cause's program for election integrity is built around this. And we have some good news, which is that in the omnibus bill, $380 million was appropriated to the states for election security, and report language that accompanied the omnibus bill said that the states may use the money for paper and for instituting post-election audit pilots and other cybersecurity measures. So, at least there is money coming down the pike for states There are 13 states which need to replace their paperless systems with actual paper. You know, Pennsylvania, where Marion was the Deputy Secretary of State, is one of them. Many jurisdictions in that state, important swing state, you know, they have no non-digital record of the vote. In other words, many jurisdictions don't have paper. So that's the good news, is that there's federal funds are on the way. They're going to be made available to the states in about, less than 45 days now. So it's up to us to make sure that those funds are spent properly and that they are used to really institute these critical reforms that there is widespread consensus around, that the ballots be paper and that post-election audits take place to check the results. It doesn't do any good to have paper ballots in every single state, and if you don't use it to check the programmers and to check the ballot scanners. So for example, last year in Rhode Island, in the November 2016 election, it was a perfect example. In North Kingstown, there was a ballot measure. They used paper, voters marked the paper was scanned, and it was clear because the results were so messed up that the scanner had been misprogrammed. They did a recount and they found the correct result. And then they realized, wow, this could be happening everywhere. And not just hacking, but just simple misprogramming. We need to make sure to go back and really do a robust audit of all of our election races. And as Marion said, that's happened in Colorado this past year. And we are encouraging many states to not only adopt paper, but adopt these rigorous post-election audit practices so that we can be very confident of the election results or correct them. You know, do a hand recount if they are not correct. So, and a good post-election audit will automatically lead to a hand recount of all of the paper ballots. That's called a risk-limiting audit. But most of the time, if you use the scientific methodology, you're only sampling a few ballots for some of the races. So we are very concerned that as election officials, as state election administrators, get this money, that they know that we think it's a priority to use it for paper and for post-election audits and for some other very critical measures which advocates can talk about on election day, such as making sure that if the voter databases or the election poll books are hacked, that voters can use a provisional ballot, or that voters can, or they have a same-day registration kind of remedy. But all of these reforms are actually, Congress is putting their money where their mouth is a little bit, and that is the good news here. So I will say, with respect to something I did want to point out, that where Common Cause stands with respect to ballot marking devices, those devices are required by federal law. The Help America Vote Act made it clear that they valued privacy and independence for all voters, and that that is part of federal law, that in federal elections there shall be one way for voters with disabilities and others to mark the ballot privately and independently, and in many cases that is using a ballot marking device. So that's an aside. But
thank you.
I am very I'm happy about this money coming down the pike, and I think we can all lift up our voices and let our election administrators know that we are with them and that we want to see these kinds of really critical changes that are low tech. They're not hard, but we got to do them, and they take political will to make happen.
Thank you so much, Susanna. We are running very short on time. We hope to have some time for questions at the end, but I'm actually going to pivot directly to Izzy Bronstein from Common Cause to talk about the Secure Vote campaign and how you can get involved, or how you can help educate your members to carry this message forward, that we can secure our elections, but we need their help. Can't hear you yet.
Izzy?
Hi, everybody. As Akane said, I'm Izzy Bronstein at Common Cause. I'm going to share this really quickly, just a quick PowerPoint about what the Secure Vote Coalition has been doing. And it unloaded itself up.
Maybe we can take one question while we're waiting.
Yeah, it's hard to hear you, Izzy. We know you were talking, but we couldn't hear you.
Okay, I'll fix that. Why don't you take a couple questions, Kenny?
Yeah, we have one question already from Jenny Flanagan. Are there any states that are good models for these cybersecurity protections that we should lift up?
So Colorado is a very good example. The state uses paper ballots. The state also conducts a post-election audit, a risk-limiting post-election audit, which brings them high confidence that the outcome is correct. There are some problems with Colorado, but by and large, the two things that we're advocating for here, Colorado does, and they have just piloted this risk-limiting audit. And the folks, election administrators in Colorado are evangelical about sharing the good news of post-election audits. And if folks in other states want to advocate for them, those election officials will get on the phone with your election officials and explain how to do it.
Great, thanks so much. Izzy, are you ready to go?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, louder if you can.
Awesome. I will scream, it's fine. Cool, so quickly, as Akani, I think, has mentioned in the beginning of the call, the Secure Our Vote Coalition is made up of a number of...
I can't hear Izzy. Is everybody else can hear her?
I can.
I will talk as loud as I can. It's made up of a number of different groups and is mostly focused on getting our grassroots communities engaged in election security so that we can really take on the two solutions that both Marion and Susanna outlined, that are, we need a paper record and we need to be able to check the results. So we need to both, have paper marked ballots by hand with an assisted device or by hand, and make sure we can actually verify that vote and have a paper record of every vote cast. These solutions are really simple. Like, I think that we get a little bit confused in the complexity of the threats, and that's really important to understand for all of us. I think when we talk about the solutions and when we're talking about the grassroots, the advocates really dig into the idea that there are two primary solutions that are pretty easy to talk about, and that's checking the results with an audit and have a paper record. So what the Secure Our Vote Coalition's been doing thus far is working on training, educating, and actually applying action to a couple of targeted campaigns. One of the really cool things we've been working on is training our local advocates to work with their local election officials to talk about election security, to train them to be messengers within their own communities, to be advocates, to actually work with their election administrators to become advocates themselves. We know election officials, as Susanna said, are some of the best folks out there to be spokespeople for election security, and the best people who have the voices of the budgets, both the state level and the federal level. So getting as many of them on our side is a great thing, and that's a thing that our local advocates are learning how to do and are proving pretty excellent at. We also have a couple of statewide priority campaigns where we're engaging local activists to support campaigns, and that's going to become even more important as we get into the omnibus funding that Susanna was talking about, and I'll talk about again in a second. We have been trying to also use this as a moment to say election security is not that complicated. We really want to educate as many people as possible using this Russia idea in everybody's heads that our elections are under threat. This is not new. Our elections have been under threat for a long time, but that there is something that they can do, and the solutions are something that not only they can do, but that their community can advocate for. We also make sure we're connecting voting rights into that narrative to make sure that folks understand that elections need to be secure and accessible all at the same time. And then we've also, like I said, been applying action and pressure on state and local campaigns. And Akani, feel free to jump in if there's anything that I'm missing. And then I just want to quickly talk about some of the tactics that we're going to be going into after the omnibus. So as Susanna laid out, the decisions on how we're going to spend these funds, we need to be transparent and effective. But unfortunately, as we've already seen in Georgia, vendors are going to come in and already are coming in, scrambling for these dollars, and are going to be pushing machines that do not provide for secure elections and do not provide for ways for folks to actually have their voices heard and make sure we can actually check every record possible. So we need to make sure that constituents are actually making their voices heard about what they want and that they want secure elections and what that means to them, because election even though, our legislators who will be doling out these dollars aren't educated necessarily in the ins and outs of this. So I want to make sure that we're pushing them on saying pretty simple things, that we need to have paper systems, that if it has the barcode, that there's also a paper record that the voter has checked. So it's not just a barcode that we're checking later on. And that we're talking about using this money for audits and new machines. So we're going to be laying out a toolkit on some of these resources and on how we want to spend the money. We really want to get activists involved in making calls to legislators, meeting with their legislators, and talking about what they want these $380 million of HAVA money spent on. And then I was going to talk a little bit about what we also do with our tactics leading up to Election Day of working with local election officials, but I'm actually going to skip that for right now. Just know that it's something that we're focused on post omnibus money, is how we partner with election officials to make sure that they're planning for 2018 and beyond.
Great. Thanks so much, Izzy. I'm going to pivot to Rio momentarily to let you know how you can help in more detail, and then hopefully we'll have a minute for questions. I just want to say we've already been working with a couple hundred local activists around the country and have had a couple victories for Secure Our Vote with allies. Washington State passed a more rigorous audit law this spring, thanks to the work of an activist who got involved on one of our last call series. And activists in Montgomery County, the third largest county in Pennsylvania, are on the road to getting paper systems in a state with 80% no paper, thanks to work from local activists working with verified voting and Secure Our Vote. Rio, can you tell the folks on the phone how to get engaged and next steps?
Rio Tazwell, I'm at People for the American Way. And the first thing we want to ask folks just on an individual level is just to share this information with your networks. Clearly the issues we're talking about today are of fundamental importance to our democracy, and we need to just get the word out there that there are such significant threats, but perhaps most importantly that there are really, basic solutions that can help mitigate this threat. So there's going to be some toolkits, as others have mentioned, that will be circulated around, and we would love your help just getting those toolkits and those resources out across your personal networks, and encouraging folks to contact their election officials on the local and the state level. If you're interested in specific states or particular areas, definitely reach out to Akane. I'm sure everyone on this call knows how to get in touch with her, afreechild@citizen.org. Another thing we want to ask is if you are part of a membership organization, that we would love for your members to join us on a series of grassroots calls that are going to be happening in April, talking about all things election security. The first one's coming up next week on April 3rd, 8 p.m. Eastern. It's going to be Election Security 101, basically just a broad overview similar to what we covered today. Actually, Professor DeMillo is going to be on again, sharing his expertise, as well as other folks from the Secure Our Vote coalition. There's some chance we'll be joined by a senator, potentially an activist as well. So stay tuned for the final lineup. There is an RSVP link already up, and sample emails that we can share if you're able to schedule something to send out to your members before next week. That would be great. There's also going to be another one of these grassroots calls the following week on April 10th, also at 8 p.m. Eastern. That one's going to be more focused on state level legislation, legislative executive focus, and we'll also be joined by various members from the Secure Our Vote coalition, including Kirsten Muller from Washington State. She's going to share her story about passing a rigorous audit bill there this session. We'll also be joined by Sarah from Common Cause Georgia, who'll be talking about defeating bad bills that give sweetheart deals to machine vendors at the expense of security. So very interesting stuff. Also, we'll be joined by Jen from Delaware, talking about positive reform bills there. And yeah, other members of the coalition will be sharing information and ways to get active for our members then. And then the third and final call of this particular series will be on April 17th, the next week, and that one will have a local focus. We'll be joined by Cami Foote, who's an elections commissioner in Inyo City, California, as well as some other experts and members of the coalition. And the RSVP links for the second two of those will be up soon. The first one coming up next week on April 3rd, we already have an RSVP link up, as I mentioned, so be sure to check that out. And if you can get an email out to your members, that'd be great. And then finally, just want to encourage folks to reach out to Izzy, who was just speaking at Common Cause about officially joining the Secure Our Vote coalition and getting more active with this critically important work. We just joined here at People for the American Way and are looking to ramp up our activism and engagement on this, particularly in the lead up to the midterms. So would definitely encourage other groups to look into doing that as well. And you can, yeah, like I said, contact Izzy about that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rio. We have just a couple minutes for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand on the panel on the right or use the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have a couple questions already. One from Karen Kirchen. For those with organizations that drive calls, it'd be helpful to have a list of state-specific asks for those states. And we will be putting something like that together in the coming weeks of what needs to be done in each state. But please send us an email, Susanna, Izzy, or I, for more information on that.
Right. I would just like to point out that that's obviously each state is at a different place. They have different needs and different ways of getting things done. Some states require regulation, just regulation. Some states, they can just go ahead and do stuff. Some states require regulation, legislation. So drilling down in each individual state and figuring out who the state leaders will listen to and getting the right messengers is critical. It may not always be us here at Common Cause and Public Citizen and PFAW, as much as we love us. We may not be the right messengers, and it's important for us to get our reforms in the hands of really effective folks. I just want to say on the federal level, we have worked across party lines with libertarian groups, the Freedom Caucus, even Women for Trump, to get this election integrity bill across in the election money across the front lines. So I think it's really important to think about all of these things.
Great, thanks. Izzy, do you want to get to Pat's question?
Sure. Pat's question was, do we have any recommendations on how to let people know about these threats without discouraging them from voting? And can we cover this in upcoming calls? I'll just say this is definitely something that we're very cautious of in all of our grassroots calls, is making sure that we're talking to folks about the threats while still making sure they don't feel cynical about our elections working for them. And it's something that we've always been cautious of, but I would love if Akini or Susanna want to cover a little bit more about how we can do that.
I mean, sure, we are always cognizant of this balance, but here's the thing. When we talk about the problems, we talk about the solutions, that goes a long way towards sort of curing hopelessness and despair. And the good news is the solutions are within reach. I mean, we don't have to build a Star Wars defense system over our whole election processes. We're talking about paper, and we're talking about checking the paper. So, and we can talk about how we are doing this and have done this, and how our NATO allies have done this. So I just think if we remain upbeat and that we're on it and we're doing it, that's sort of critical. If we're doom and gloom and just list how many things have been attacked, you're right, that's going to have a depressive, suppressive effect. But I think, we always say, if you don't vote at all, because then your vote really won't count. So it's critical to work on these reforms and be optimistic and vote.
I would just chime in that not just because of the level of coverage, but also because of the oppression that marginalized communities experience in trying to access their vote already, and the voter suppression campaigns that are ongoing. A lot of folks feel like their vote can be hacked already. And if we don't acknowledge that we actually don't come across as out of touch. So I think there's a much better way to say, like, we want to make sure that your vote is counted, and we're going to take these steps with you. Will you help us, if you can, to protect your vote and make sure that you can transparently and observably make sure that it is counted? Because every person interfering with this process, whether it's a hacker or someone trying to suppress your vote, is counting on you not asserting that right. And you want to fight them as best as you can by standing up and getting out there and voting. And that, unfortunately, we're after the hour. We do have a recording of this call. If you had colleagues that missed it, they can certainly join the grassroots call on Tuesday night of next week for some of the same content, but please get in touch with Rio or Izzy or Suzanne or I with any questions or need for more materials. And thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks all.